cave was cold, not the kind of cold that simply touches the skin, the kind that slowly enters the bones, the kind that lingers through the night and follows a man into his thoughts. Somewhere inside the wilderness of Judah, David sat in darkness. No throne, no crown, no army, no celebration, no sign that the promise of God was getting any closer. Only stone walls, silence, and uncertainty. Years earlier, the prophet Samuel had poured oil over his head and declared what seemed impossible. God had chosen him. God had appointed him. God had destined him for greatness. But sitting inside that cave, those words must have felt very far away, perhaps farther away than ever. This is the part of David's story most people skip. The waiting, the hidden years, the years between the promise and the fulfillment. Because promises are exciting, waiting is not. Miracles inspire people. Unanswered prayers do not. Victory attracts crowds, but almost nobody volunteers to hear about caves. Yet it was inside those caves that David became the man history remembers. Not on the battlefield, not in the palace, not during the celebrations, in the darkness. And perhaps that truth is uncomfortable, because most people want God's purpose without God's process. They want the throne, but not the cave, the victory, but not the wilderness, the blessing, but not the waiting. David was learning something painful. God's silence is often not God's absence, but when you are suffering, those two things can feel identical. Day after day, Saul continued hunting him. Imagine the emotional exhaustion. Every sunrise bringing uncertainty, every footstep potentially dangerous, every unfamiliar sound triggering fear. There was no guarantee of survival, no guarantee of tomorrow, and perhaps, worst of all, no explanation. That is often where faith suffers the most, not in pain itself, but in confusion. Pain can be endured if people understand why it exists. But confusion slowly eats away at confidence. David must have wondered countless times, why would God choose me only to leave me here? Why would God promise a throne, then send me into hiding? Why would God anoint me and allow Saul to hunt me like an animal? These are not questions of rebellion. They are questions of a wounded heart. And perhaps some of the people listening tonight know exactly what that feels like. The promotion never came. The healing never came. The relationship collapsed. The prayer remained unanswered. The future you believed God promised suddenly seems impossible. And somewhere inside your soul, the same question begins forming. Did I misunderstand God? David knew that feeling more than most people realize, because contrary to popular imagination, David was not always fearless. The Psalms reveal a man wrestling constantly with anxiety, fear, loneliness, despair. Some nights he could not see hope clearly. Some nights his confidence disappeared completely. Some nights he felt forgotten. And perhaps that honesty is one of the greatest gifts Scripture gives us. The heroes of faith were not emotionally invincible. They were human, deeply human. David cried. David doubted. David feared. David struggled, and still, God did not abandon him. One day, something unexpected happened. Men began arriving at the cave. Not successful men, not powerful men, not respected leaders. The broken ones arrived first. The distressed, the indebted, the rejected, the desperate. Imagine that scene. David himself felt exhausted, confused, disappointed, and now hundreds of struggling people were looking to him for guidance. Perhaps this felt almost cruel. How could he lead others when he barely understood his own life? How could he provide hope when he himself was struggling to find it? And yet, something extraordinary was happening without realizing it. God was building a kingdom in the shadows. While David focused on what he lacked, God was preparing what David would eventually need. Isn't that often how God works? People look for visible progress. God works beneath the surface. People demand immediate answers. God develops character. People ask for clarity. God teaches trust. And trust is impossible without uncertainty. That is why silence feels so painful, because silence forces faith to survive without constant reassurance. Most people think faith grows through miracles. Sometimes it does, but often, faith grows through silence. Faith grows when prayers appear unanswered. Faith grows when heaven seems distant. Faith grows when emotions say one thing, and conviction says another. Inside that cave, David was slowly becoming someone different, not stronger physically, stronger spiritually. The young shepherd who once defeated Goliath through courage was now learning a much harder lesson: patience. And patience is a battlefield few people talk about. Because patience requires surrender. It requires releasing control. It requires accepting that some answers will not arrive according to your schedule. And perhaps nowhere is this battle more visible than in David's Psalms. Listen carefully to his words. They do not sound like someone living a comfortable life. They sound like someone fighting for hope, someone refusing to surrender despite overwhelming uncertainty, someone choosing faith while feeling abandoned. Again and again, David cries out. Again and again, he questions. Again and again, he waits. And yet, something remarkable happens. His prayers often begin in darkness, but end in trust. Not because circumstances changed, because perspective changed. That distinction matters. God did not always remove David's problems immediately, but he gradually transformed David's heart inside them. And perhaps that is one of the deepest mysteries of spiritual growth. People pray for changed circumstances. God often begins by changing them. The cave was becoming a classroom. The silence was becoming a teacher. The waiting was becoming preparation. But David could not see the full picture yet. None of us can while living inside the story. And then, something happened that made everything even more confusing. Something that should have ended the nightmare. Something that appeared to be God's answer. Saul entered a cave, alone, unprotected, completely vulnerable. The very cave where David and his men were hiding. Imagine the tension. Imagine the pounding hearts. Imagine the whispers. This is it. This is your moment. God has delivered your enemy into your hands. For years, David had been running. For years, Saul had hunted him. And now, suddenly, victory seemed within reach. The promise looked one decision away, one strike, one action, one moment, and everything would change. Surely this was God's answer. Surely this was why David had suffered all these years. Surely heaven was finally speaking. But what happened next reveals something profound, something that separates spiritual maturity from human ambition. David hesitated, not because he feared Saul, because he feared disobeying God. Even after years of silence, even after years of confusion, even after years of suffering, David still refused to force God's timing. That decision may have been harder than defeating Goliath. Anyone can act when anger is strong. Anyone can retaliate when wounded. Anyone can seize power when opportunity appears. But restraint, trust, patience, those require a different kind of strength. David cut only a corner of Saul's robe, nothing more, and afterward, his conscience troubled him. Think about that. The man being hunted felt guilty for doing even that much, because somewhere inside David, God's voice still mattered more than his circumstances, even during silence, especially during silence. And perhaps that is the real battle. Not whether God is silent, but whether we remain faithful when He is. Because eventually everyone encounters a season where heaven feels quiet, a season where answers disappear, a season where understanding fades, and in those moments, people discover what their faith is truly built upon. David was about to discover that the silence was not punishment, it was preparation. But before he understood that truth, the darkness would become even deeper, the waiting would become even longer, and the wound inside his soul would face a test far greater than anything he had experienced so far. Because sometimes, the hardest part of God's plan comes right before the breakthrough.